Get ready with me as I highlight some books that were absolutely a favorite and not so favorites from September and October. Hey book babes, I am coming to you live from my room this time as I'm still figuring out where to record. We haven't done a wrap up in a really long time, so get your things, get ready, and let's just get ready as I ramble on and on about all these books. So it's been a while. Hi, I've missed you, missed doing my skincare alongside with you. So we're actually gonna go all the way back to September and highlight some books. I actually had a great reading month in October, but if I were to highlight every single thing in one video, we would be here for like an hour or more. Hopefully you like hanging out with me for an hour or more. But still, let's just condense this down. Starting with top favorites, which is really what I'm gonna do in this video, I need to talk about A Fire Endless. This book was so incredible. Now, if you watched my wrap up from August, A River Enchanted was not really a favorite. I ended up giving that book 3 stars. It was just so lengthy and didn't really move along, and I found myself bored quite often, and it really sucks because her writing is awesome. I just could not get into it for the life of me until that final like 10% or legit 10 pages. However, A Fire Endless was amazing. Right from the beginning, it just captured me. So if you're on the fence about this book, this is one of those rare instances where the sequel is like 1,000 times better than the first book. It was just so good. You know the characters already. I really appreciate all the groundwork she did in A River Enchanted so that we really felt connected to these characters. And I was actually really happy to follow along with every single character, even my least favorite characters in the first book. I was just so excited to see them in the second book. Her writing, again, superior, top notch. It was gorgeous. I have no idea how this author just got this inspiration to write this book. I mean, she really incorporates nature. She has some Scottish lore in there as well, which is where her inspiration came from. But all her characters are so lovely and have a development in like really significant ways, but she does them in these small ways that, I don't know, it was just really awesome seeing all these characters progress and change and us connect as readers in different ways. This book was amazing and I cannot recommend it enough, and I'm actually gonna give it 5 stars. The next book that really shocked me was actually Never a Hero. This is also a sequel, and I feel like I need to make a video talking about books where the sequel was better than the first book, or like books that I gave a second chance and continued and the series just got better, because this would be in that video for sure. So Only a Monster, I would say, is okay. I also ended up giving it 3 stars because I just didn't really like the main character. I didn't connect with her, and she was very much the narrator. Like, I think it was first person, I believe. I don't remember anymore. Even if the book wasn't in first person, clearly it was very much about Joan and her perspective and her thoughts and feelings, and I just did not relate to her at all. I actually found her pretty annoying at some points, really repetitive. The writing felt repetitive as well, where the way she described her love and her feelings for the guy Nick, the main guy who ended up being a hunter of monsters, which is a hunter of her and her family. It was just the same thing over and over of, I knew you in another life, I've known you my whole life, it feels like I've known you my whole life, and that just got really old after a while, and it was repeated up until the very, very end of the book. However, the last 10 pages were also incredible. I was really at the edge of my seat, and the world building, like the world itself, sounded so interesting, and I wish the author had gone deeper in the first book about that world, about monsters and their families and their family symbols and what their power actually is, which we actually get into in book 2. And honestly, I think that was a really big reason why I ended up loving book 2 so much, because we get more families, we get more monsters. She did an incredible job at storytelling, like basically resetting everything, but we don't have to go through the same thing all over again. Joan ends up going through a different type of grief, a different type of heartbreak. If you know the ending of Only a Monster, you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a reset. It was just so good. there are so many twists and turns and mystery as to what's actually going on, because you do get that sense in the first book that you don't know everything and you don't know what's really going on, because Joan is so new to this world, so are we. And in this book she gets more answers, but there's still also more questions. And the way the author talks about grief and family here, those themes are so beautiful. She did them so well. I ended up sending this author a DM saying, just expressing how much I adored this book, because she did an incredible job. She grew in her writing, which she's talked about before. So I told her, like, thank you for always like growing in your writing, for doing so much of this work, because that book was so beautiful. And now I must own a physical copy or an SE of that book, because it is so nice. And I actually really wanted to reread it, and I couldn't believe she left us on that cliffhanger. I was so upset. So I am desperately waiting for an announcement for book 3, and like, when is it gonna come out? Let it be soon, because I have to know. I want to continue this book so bad. Now, your girl has continued her adventure with ACOTAR. So I ended up reading A Court of Frost and Starlight, and then I ended up reading A Court of Silver Flame. So I am all caught up. Like, your girl is caught up to the ACOTAR world. I do believe the author is working on her next ACOTAR book, but it's not out yet, so I've caught up. And a lot of people said A Court of Frost and Starlight, all these names, a court of you guys get it, the novella, okay? People said that this novella was going to be boring and not really that interesting and a waste of time, but I actually loved it. And I mean, I loved it even more than the first book, ACOTAR, okay? Like, let's be real. This book was so cute. It was so wholesome. I kind of wish I read it more in winter, because it reads very much like a Christmas story, because they are celebrating the winter solstice and their equivalent of basically Christmas. And it was just so cute seeing all of them in Valaris, like exploring, still dealing with the aftermath of what happens in A Court of Wings and Ruin, which I can also appreciate, because you can't just like move on. And I knew that A Court of Silver Flames was a Nesta story, so I was happy that I could see like where Feyre and Rhysand were at and what they were thinking. I thought it was really cute and wholesome. I definitely recommend you read it more during like winter if you do pick this novella up, and just know that it's not like filled with a plot line, which I came with an expectation of it's just Faye be Faying. Like, that's all I expected from this, so maybe that's why I didn't find it boring. Court of Frost and Starlight was like a solid 5 stars for me, believe it or not. It was just a novella, low stakes. There wasn't this super high expectation. It did what it needed to do, which brings me to A Court of Silver Flames. Boy, okay, so I am honestly, and this might be controversial because I know a lot of people love this book, but I am between like 3 stars, 4, not 2, because her writing and world building was still rich and lush, so I'm not gonna go 2 stars, but I think more of a 3, and here's why. So in this one we get to know Nesta, which like I was so mad at Nesta, okay? I'm definitely one of those people that's like, if you have a problem, if there's an issue, like just talk about it, like figure it out. And I don't mean like talk about it like, oh, you have to talk about it, or if you're not ready then that's bad or something like that. I just mean like, what was her problem? You know, I just sincerely did not understand why she had to talk back or reply to people the way she did. It was so mean. It was so unnecessary. No one really provoked her, but she was just like so mean, and I felt like a problem with that. So I was okay with her having a redemption as long as she actually verbalized and apologized straight up to Feyre, and like especially Feyre, for all the things she did. Like, acknowledge the pain and the horribleness you have caused. I didn't want a story where it's like, oh, and then she became a better person, but like no one talks about it and she never apologized and we're all okay with that. No, this really is the book world where you talk about characters as if they're actual real characters that did you some harm. The point is, I was not having it, okay? We start her story, and I mean, I'm all about a good arc. I was ready for this book. I just had some issues for this book. For one, it felt longer than it needed to be, like yes and no, because I do appreciate how much of a struggle it was for her, and I think the book did have to be pretty long for us to see just the repetition of her failures, of her growth, her resistance, how much she didn't want to change, how much she didn't want to acknowledge her trauma and pain. And like that's one side. So we have like Nesta's personal trauma and everything she's going through, and then we have to face the way she's been reacting and treating everyone else around her, and especially her sister Feyre. Why was she so rude to her? Why was she just okay throwing her to the wolves? And why was she all up Elaine's butt, like freaking loving her so much? It just didn't make sense, and I wish this book could explain to us why she loved Elaine so much, and it just didn't. So if there is ever an Elaine book in there, I hope we get answers there. As for this book, we do get more answers as to why she was so upset with Feyre or why she would talk back to her. Like yes and no. Still not as much as I was hoping for, because that dispute, that hatred seems like really deep, like it goes way back. And instead we kind of get a more recent anger, why she was recently angry at her, like actions that Feyre took that made Nesta feel less than, not because of Feyre's fault, but because of who Nesta was at that time, made her feel little and made her basically jealous of Feyre. I think that's why it had to be pretty long, but at the same time I was like, is this just the author's excuse to put these characters in all different positions? Because that was like wild to me. Okay, like there was a lot that Nesta was going through, and the book is very clear that she's using like sexual relationships as a way to escape and cope with her trauma, which is like not coping at all and not healthy for her. I was fine with that being a part of her story, but when it just kept repeating of like all the different things in graphic detail of what they were doing, the first few times I was like, okay, this is just a part of the book, whatever. I heard it was smutty, blah blah blah, and it just kept happening over and over. Even though Cassian knew it was unhealthy for her, she did as well. It was just a mess. It felt so icky from like his point, because he knew she wasn't okay and he still went for it anyway. And also the repetition of it, I was like, at this point, what is this serving? Like I had already learned my lesson that Nesta is using this to escape, that she clearly feels something for Cassian, but she's refusing to accept it or acknowledge it. Cassian's heartbroken and hurt, but will take her any way that he can, like will accept any part of her. So I understood that, like as a reader, I got that. And then we still had like 10 more scenes with like 50 different positions and like super graphic, and I was like, what is the point? Like it's just not serving the purpose of the plot anymore, in my opinion, unless you just want to read that type of scene. So it felt like that from the author, which is fine. Like if that's your cup of tea, like go for it. It was not mine. I did hear some reviews talk about how this actually empowers or brings back like women's sexuality, and I can see that point of view too, except I think it was also harmful, like the way she was using that as a coping mechanism, or really as a way to escape her trauma, was so unhealthy and sad. So yeah, maybe she's like enjoying this, but she feels so crummy afterwards and has felt crummy ever since. But like I said, it's a whole other thing. I think it would have to be a whole other video, and I'm not trying to read into it like too much, but it was just a quick observation. Other than that, like I loved all the battle scenes, all the Valkyrie. I loved the friendships. That was like a top thing for me. The friendships between her and the other girl, it was like everything. It was just so wholesome, so sweet, and I loved seeing how these friends were her found family, that even Nesta acknowledges, like, is this how Feyre feels with Ian, the inner circle, like all of that. I think that's where her healing starts coming into, where she's no longer upset at Feyre or feeling like Feyre hates her family. She instead realizes like, oh, it's a place where you feel like you belong and you're chosen and you're picked, and it's different, like this different found family. And I love that so much. I loved how badass of a character Nesta was. There's definitely more plots in there, like more stuff happening in there with Rhysand and all these different relics. Like you'll know what I mean if you actually read this book. And that's why I was like 3, 4, because so many parts of this, the world building, the growth, like all of that is 4 stars, but also 3 stars because long unnecessary scenes, in my opinion. Are we just ignoring some really problematic behavior in here? Because let me just tell you, my man Aries, who's from the Autumn Court and may or may not have done certain things to Mor, made a point at Cassian where they had this really intense interaction. Like my man's had a point. That's all I'm saying for this video. Ooh, hopefully that's better lighting. I was starting to look like no-nose Voldemort. Okay, next up we have House of Roots and Ruin, which is once more a sequel. I am just continuing all these series, and I was really happy because all of these books were actually fitting the prompt that I have for the readathon that I'm currently hosting, the Falling into Fantasy readathon. Link below if you want to join. This book was just so perfect for like spookiness and creepiness. It is a sequel to A House of Salt and Sorrow, and that is a retelling or a spin on the 12 Dancing Princesses, which I have yet to read. I really like that book, probably because it was my first story of the 12 Dancing Princesses, and I was really excited to follow a different sister in this book. And let me just tell you, it gets wild. It gets creepy. It really gets horror-esque. It gets like mutant, what is happening, murder, mystery, spin with a horrible twist on love. And that ending was insanity. It left me screaming, and I quickly went to the author's page like, ma'am, excuse me, when are you releasing book 3? Because there's zero announcement, there is zero title, and you cannot leave us like this. Like, this is unacceptable. I definitely recommend you read the first book, and it's definitely more of a spooky story. Some people did say that it actually left them pretty creeped out. It was okay for me. Like, the first book and even the second book didn't leave me creeped out, but if you're more sensitive to that stuff, you might not like these two books. If you are really interested in using nature as a way to like storytell and make it a little bit horror and like have some mystery, some love, some forbidden love in there, these two books are like the books for you. Okay, it's really good. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars because, listen, the writing did get a little bit cheesy sometimes, right? Like the plot, the character was a bit naive at times, or like very naive a lot of the times, but I felt like the storytelling and that twist at the end made it so worth it. So it was really good. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I love it. Cannot wait for book 3. Next up, we have an arc that is actually already released, and that is Starling House. Starling House is such a different love story than you normally see maybe in like fantasy or whatever, but it's also an adult novel, so that's different. Starling House actually features basically a haunted house. Like, if you've ever been to a small town, or you know, maybe you're from a small town, there's always that creepy house in the corner. It has a lore and a story, and this small town in Kentucky has that house, the Starling House. And there's always like people, the Starlings, that move in and out of that house. They always die in some weird, strange way, and it's always occupied. And you have this character that dreams about this house, that longs for this house, and it just makes absolutely no sense because she shouldn't long for a house that she's never been to, you know, that it's never been her house. Clearly this house is calling her, and the current occupant of that house, he is quite strange. He is considered to be, first of all, ugly, which I actually ended up laughing so hard that I was like, okay, like that's our MC, I guess, just ugly. Just like she's also considered not really attractive. And I bring those points up because I actually really enjoyed reading a book where they weren't conventionally beautiful, and so people didn't just accept all this behavior because they were beautiful, which I think tends to happen in a lot of books. You're doing all this problematic behavior, but it's fine because you're beautiful and we trust you, you know, like, okay. So in this case, like, that's not the case. So a lot of people are like really rough with these characters, and these characters have gone through it. We also have an MC that's actually struggling. Really, she has no money. She lost her mom really young. She's taking care of her brother, basically making sure that he's not taken by child protective services and all this stuff because she's underage or like they don't have much. And I loved seeing their relationship too, that brother-sister relationship, and how her brother was also encouraging her to live beyond what they have and like not just live for him, and he also wants to take care of her. It was just so wholesome and like so sweet. There is so much mystery around this house. Like, we don't know where it came from, what it means, like anything like that, and I think that's what made the book really interesting. Interesting fact, this book was actually very slow, but it was a great slow. I don't mind a slow book, but normally when it's this type of slow, it can be really disengaging for me, but it was not. I was just hooked. I wanted to know everything. I think she was a great storyteller, the author, because the way she unravels the mystery of this house is what keeps you engaged, why you hang on a little bit more, and that's why you want to know what happens. So this book was actually really great. It is a very different read than what I normally go for, but I was given the ARC. I think I mentioned that. I hope I mentioned that. So I actually ended up getting a special edition, which you saw in one of my book hauls, or actually you're gonna see that soon. I unboxed it, but I haven't shown it. So that video is coming up, part 2 of the ultimate unboxing. I was really happy to own an actual special edition because that book was really great. So I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. Loved it so much. Definitely recommend it for these like wintry months where you just want something more gothic and mysterious. This is gonna be that book for you. Next up we have another arc, an arc that was so good I did not want to finish it. I wanted to prolong it as much as possible because I knew the ending was gonna be insane, and that is What the River Knows. Oh my gosh, luckily this book is out already. You can go grab it. It came out like October 31st. They actually moved up the release date from November something, like November 12th or something, to October 31st. It is such a good book. I think it's the best book this author has written to date. You can tell her heart and soul was into it. It is a fantasy book, but it's set up in Egypt, and the main character is Latina. She is so naive. There's so much mystery, but the number one thing I loved about this book is that you could tell Isabel Ibanez actually went to Egypt, because she did, and that she was able to really write and put you in that place through her book. The descriptions, the scenery was just gorgeous. Like I really felt like she was writing from her heart, and I really loved how the characters were also honest with themselves. Like Inez is pretty sheltered, like she's never been out. This also is a historical fantasy romance, whatever, because this character is in the 1800s, and during that time like women have to have chaperones and they can't travel by themselves, and so she's so scandalous for traveling on her own and like pretending that her husband died, and so now she's a widow. It made me laugh, but it's also very brave of Inez to do because she wants to find out what happened to her parents. Her parents died while digging in Egypt. Like she doesn't really know what happened to them, and because they would spend literally 6 months out of the year in Egypt, she really didn't see them all that much. Like they would come home and she could clearly see that they weren't happy being back in their hometown, which I can't remember anymore if it was Argentina or Bolivia, but I'm pretty sure it was Argentina. So she could clearly see they weren't happy being back there with her, which really hurt her. So she has this grief and anger, you know, and then they would go back to Egypt until one day she just got a letter that they passed away. And so now she's with her uncle who's still there, her uncle who was the main person leading these excursions and all of that stuff. And her parents were basically his sponsors. So they would pay for all these trips, but also join because they just had such a love for Egypt. And so this uncle's kind of shady. You're like, is this uncle like hiding? Like what is he? He's clearly hiding something, but like did he do something to the parents, or like what's going on? Because he's in charge of Inez's money and all of that stuff, and he's just not having it with her being there. Of course our MC has to get in there anyway so that she can find out more stuff, and that's basically our story. Like that's where we go. And I actually really enjoyed this book. It was, like I said, the scenery was really great. I definitely recommend it. I think, like I mentioned, it is her best work yet, and it was so good. So thank you to both publishers of Starling House and of What the River Knows for giving me an ARC, because those stories were just so lush and so great. Okay, next up we have Killers of the Flower Moon. So this was a true crime book, okay? And it's about the Osage people and the killings that happen here in the US in Oklahoma. The government just stole a bunch of land and pushed a lot of natives out. And every tribe, every native land has its own story. So here we're focused on the Osage people, and part of history that I didn't even know, you know, that happened. The Osage people were basically left with the worst possible land, like literally land that no one could farm in, no one could do anything. They also had to purchase land to be in, which is insane. It's like they get kicked out of their native land and their home, and then they're forced to also pick a lot and like pay for it. So this tribe ended up picking this land because they quote unquote said, like, if the white man doesn't want this, the white man can't farm, can't do anything on this land, like we'll take it because they won't bother us again, right? So they ended up purchasing the land, and can you imagine, they struck oil. They struck a ton of oil on this unwanted land that's been sitting there, super rocky, all this stuff. Of course, became incredibly wealthy. I mean, they sent their kids to boarding school abroad. They had the latest cars, they had these amazing houses, like all these servants, just like everything, you know. And it's like, why shouldn't they? They're the ones that were kicked out, and you know, they were handed a piece of land that clearly the government didn't want, and like everyone thought they were just gonna die there, and they put restrictions on them to not hunt a certain way, and they had to farm another way, where when they knew that the land was not good soil, it was not good land. So they ended up striking all this oil, and of course that attracts people that also want a piece of that land and a piece of the wealth. While they did have some type of treaty with the government, those Osage people were really smart in making sure they didn't end up like other tribes around them, where it was a massacre, their land stolen again, and people fighting over land because clearly it's wealthy. And a lot of elders actually in this tribe were actually sad that they struck oil, because they knew that the quote-unquote like white man would come and like steal all of this, that the Osage people would not know peace until the oil would run out and they could go back to their own traditional ways. And unfortunately a lot of that became true. So because these people were so wealthy, suddenly there were a lot of people dying and missing, and it was just really chaotic. But because the government doesn't care, it was just so blatantly racist at this time. A lot of people, like the police, all this stuff, they were so corrupt. There was really no police system to speak of. We were coming out of the Texas Ranger era, and all of these jailers and bailers were actually in cahoots with criminals, so no one was really looking into investigating these murders. And when the tribe ended up hiring private investigators, and they were actually close to solving some stuff, they would mysteriously end up dead. So it was just really problematic. It's just super conspiracy-like. Something's so wrong. And this book dives into uncovering the truth of what happened, and really focuses on a main family, where the main woman, Molly, talks about her sisters, like all of them just dying, and like how her husband is her main support, and like just how she goes about trying to find out what happened to her sister who was clearly murdered, and then later realizing like so were her other sisters and her mom. It's a really intense story, but I think it's so important. Like if you don't know more about Native history, which November is Native Indigenous Month, so I would say go and like read this book and find out more, or read other stories that don't just have to do with, you know, the murders of Native people, Native land, but like it's important to know these parts of history that I don't think a lot of schools teach. And I'm really surprised, again, I didn't know about this one, because my schools were actually pretty good at like telling us about Native lands and like going beyond just the tragedies of Native American people, and actually talking about like everything as a whole and being real with history, because these things did happen, okay? This is a part of the US history and what we've done and what we've lived through, and like why we're here today. I did end up giving this like 4 stars, and not because of the story. I think that is so important, but it was a little too textbook-ish sometimes, so I do give you a warning that it's not gonna be this really big storyteller. This author is a journalist, and fortunately he is a friend of the Osage people, because they did share with him a lot and like actually invited him to even watch the movie adaptation there with them, because they appreciated the way it was done. He is very journalistic, and so I'm not surprised that the story is very like factual and very clear, and it isn't until the very end that you actually hear his voice and more of him. And I think that's when his actual heart for the Osage people and his admiration for them and like their wisdom and how they went about all of this to make sure they get what's fair, I think that finally shines at the end. But for most of the book, it's really textbook. So definitely go in there knowing that like you're being told like history and facts, and not really like perspective or like heart into it until the very end. And that's why I ended up giving it 4 in that sense. But in terms of importance and like how much I learned in this, because the author goes into the FBI and how the FBI was formed here and like what they missed, and very clearly giving you so much information so that you understand the point. 5 stars. So that's it. I did watch the movie. I 100% recommend the book more, because I think the movie did focus a little bit too much on the family of the white side of the family and like their struggle and their conspiracies, and less on just how amazing the Osage were at navigating like this system. Like the system's already pretty hard to navigate. It does have systemic racism integrated in it, but especially during this time where they weren't even considered human. The author really states what they were called and all this stuff, like just the breakdown, like they couldn't manage their own money, an Indian man isn't considered actually competent and stuff, just all these messed up stuff. And for them to still step into Washington DC and like demand and do things and move is just so admirable, and something I wish that the movie showcased a lot more. So I definitely recommend that. You also get way more information of what happens at the end and just how jacked up the whole situation was from certain people. Again, read the book, highly recommend. Then if you want, you can go watch the movie, which is like over 3 hours long. So definitely really important, and I definitely recommend that you read it. So we briefly talked about the Sarah J Maas world, and let me just say, now that I'm done with ACOTAR, I'm actually reading Throne of Glass. Yes, I am. I'm reading Throne of Glass, and I started book 1 and I was so freaking hooked. Okay, like right from the beginning. I love the character Selena, and I am really enjoying this. So I'm actually going out of publication order, and I'm going in an order where it's supposed to hit you in the gut the most. It's supposed to be super emotional. I have to say that when I met some of these characters, I was like, Reeson, darling, is that you right there? Is this the blueprint? Because the author started writing this book when she was 16. It started off as a fan fiction, or not a fan fiction, but like a retelling of what if Cinderella wasn't there to meet the prince? What if she was there to assassinate him? And so she wrote this story online, and then it became really popular. So she took it off, started writing a version she could publish, and published it. And again, at 16, this is what she was doing. So I was really surprised that her writing was better in this than it was in the first book of ACOTAR. It was just so good. Like, her writing was insanely better, even though it was like one of the first series she's ever written. And so I'm making sure I'm reading this one so that I can move on to Croissant City and move on with my life, because that's the order that a lot of fans told me to go in. Other people are like, oh, you should have read Crescent City first and then Throne of Glass. I don't know. I felt more like the main idea or the main tip was to read a Throne of Glass first. So I really liked it. I'm really enjoying it. And I'm also a person that likes the tournament trope. So I think that's why I liked it, because a lot of people kind of sigh at Throne of Glass. And I liked it because you get to really know the characters and see like what Kale is like and what Dorian is like. And I'm really excited to just basically cry and have my heart broken. Here we go. Because other books released this month, I pretty much stopped the series real quick to read those and like finish whatever I have next first. So I will be reading Crowd of Midnight, I believe is the next one. So we'll see how that goes. I will have a special video that talks about all of this, but basically I didn't think I would ever be pulled into this universe, and here I am. Throne of Glass is 4 stars to me. I really liked it. It got me hooked. I binged through it pretty freaking fast. I think I finished it in like a day or two, or a day and a half. We'll see like 14, 15 books later what I think and how it's going. But so far, I'm sold. I'm here. I'm on this journey. I hopped on the train. long train. We'll see how it goes. The last book I want to highlight is actually Song of Achilles. Listen, I thought this was gonna be like a great book because I heard it just made people cry and it's really emotional and all this stuff. Let me just say, it was not what I thought it would be. I don't know if it's because I've read other retellings now and I saw some of these characters in those books, and so I got to learn more about Achilles and Patroclus in other lightings, like closer to the original text, which is really that Achilles is hot-tempered and like always really like prideful, kind of acts without thinking, and Patroclus is actually his equal, so he grounds him, he calls him out. They're so close. We don't know really if it was romantic or not, and so that's why these retellings go one way or the other, because the original text doesn't really clarify if they're actually together or if they're just really brothers in arms and so close. And I really didn't like the way they portrayed Patroclus in this book. They made him weak. Really, like, Achilles and Patroclus were such a good team together that it's so sad seeing Patroclus minimized and diminished into this weakling. Basically, in this retelling and in the original text, he does something, he manages to do something to someone, but in this one, it's just just a huge shocker, and it's unbelievable, and it's just sad to realize like Patroclus was so much more. I was just so bummed for him, and the ending was wild, and I was honestly really sad about the mother too, because all the retellings I've read and in the original one, I actually loved Achilles so much and his love for Patroclus that when certain things happen, the mom is like super there for Achilles. That's all I'm gonna say, okay? Just she's there for him. In this one, she's so mean. She talks down to Patroclus. She hates him. She's just diminishes everything her son tries to have with him, and that really upset me because again, I think that's an added layer of showing Achilles' deep love for Patroclus, like how much he loved him and cared for him. Making his mom this way just took away from that, in my opinion. And so there was a lot of that, and we also continued seeing like more basically the R word in here without really acknowledging it or explaining it. Like the author kind of just went through and like added it in there without really breaking it down, which is what a lot of these other retellings are actually doing. Like other retellings are actually calling it out and like making changes and, you know, really showing how problematic it is and how it shouldn't just be something accepted, and this isn't the case. Outside of this, I also read that the author is writing a sapphic retelling, and she's under a lot of fire right now because she's very graphic in all of these books that are you know, like male. And now that it's female, she's not graphic at all, or only puts like a kiss or something. And a lot of people, a lot of reviewers from the LGBTQ community are saying that that's just super problematic because it continues this sense of like making one thing like a fetish or acceptable. The point is like she's under fire for like not being as romantic or as graphic in one and being romantic and graphic in the other. And so that is a discussion that's being had right now. Maybe if I hadn't read the other retellings, I would enjoy this a lot more and I would have cried and I would have felt it, but I wanted more, and we didn't even get a point of view from Achilles' side, which was really sad because I wanted to see how much he loved Patroclus. It kind of felt like Patroclus was just super obsessed with him, and it wasn't really romance or love or selfless, and we never got that from Achilles, which really disappointed me because again, Patroclus was just screwed in this book. He was just made to look like so bad, and that just made me really sad. So that's why I ended up giving Song of Achilles 3 stars, which I'm sure is crazy because this book just has 5 stars nearly everywhere I go. So those are the highlights of the last 2 months. There are definitely way more books. You can connect with me in any of my socials down below. If you enjoyed all the rambles, all the shenanigans, make sure you hit subscribe. It means so much to me and to this channel. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!